Hi everybody, Jim here with just a quick note that this one is going to go a little long, but that's because we hit on some really interesting stuff with Dr. Anna Dornhaus here, so I think y'all are going to like it. That said, let's go ahead and get started as always. Hi everybody, and welcome back to Biology Bios. My name is Jim Edelman. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Memphis. And my purpose with this podcast is really twofold. First, I want to let folks know that most Thursdays during the semester, we have talks by visiting researchers at 4 p.m. in Ellington Hall. And that's folks from all over the country and world talking about the really cool biological research that they do. The second purpose is to have those folks here learn a little bit more about them, how they got where they are, and what really excites them about the research they do. In addition, I'd like to say a quick disclaimer that I borrowed these questions from Rhett Miller's excellent podcast called Wheels Off, so please check that out as well. But without further ado, let's get to this week's guest. Thanks so much for being here. Dr. Anna Dornhaus, thank you so much for being here, and welcome to Biology Bios.
Thank you very much.
So the first thing I like to do is kind of a really brief introduction to who you are, what you do, sort of, like the kind of elevator pitch of what your research is about.
Yeah, my research is about collective behavior. So I'm very interested in how systems that consist of lots of autonomous individuals that somehow are evolved to solve problems together, how they do that. What level of coordination should they have? What strategies should they use to communicate with each other? And what information should, in fact, be communicated? So my study systems are ants and bees, social insects. They live in groups of really anything from a handful of individuals to thousands or even hundreds of thousands of individuals. And in my lab, we're interested in how these individuals coordinate their actions and how they achieve adaptive collective behavior. And that can be in different contexts from, for example, searching. A few individuals have to search a large area. What strategies do they use to not duplicate their efforts, to coordinate well, to contests with other colonies, to division of labor inside the colony, communication during foraging, what information is useful to communicate and what information is not useful to communicate, that kind of thing.
Very cool.
I was going to say, I also often work with people who study other kinds of such collective systems. For example, for many years, I've worked with people in computer science who are interested in things like distributed computing, which is faced with very similar problems where you have maybe lots of computers linked together in a computer network, or you have independent software agents that are interacting with each other. And in all of those systems are faced with the same questions of how do you optimize collective behavior, collective outcomes, what degree of interaction and communication is adaptive, and where can that coordination between individuals in fact fail and produce counterintuitive or maladaptive outcomes at the collective level.
That's super neat. I love that sort of bio-inspired design, right? I mean, we think about it in like biophysics, right? And like, how do you make a better airplane, that sort of thing. But like, that's super cool to think of bio-inspired computing systems. I love it. So, and also you were talking about the systems you work in. Do you, so you're in Arizona, you're in Tucson, like we just actually talked a little about before the interview. Do you go out in the field there to study the critters, or where are your critters from?
Yeah, we do sometimes go out in the field and study them in the natural context where they are with all the other species they're interacting with, but we also do take them into the lab quite often. So my main study systems are Bombus impatiens, which is a bumblebee that's not actually native to Arizona, and we actually get those from a commercial breeder. So bumblebees are great lab animals in that you can mail order them, and they're quite happy to live in a box and then fly out into another box, which is their outside. And they're very trainable. So whenever we ask questions that intertwine sort of individual intelligence or individual problem solving with collective problem solving, bumblebees are great model system for that. And then we also study an ant that in English is called a rock ant, but the scientific name is Temnothorax rugatulus. And we collect that here locally in Arizona. So we drive up the mountain and collect colonies and sometimes study them where they are in the wild, but we often take them back to the lab as well. And then we keep them in these little glass nests. They're very hardy, and they do all kinds of things that they do outside happily in the lab as well.
Very nice. Yeah. They sound like perfect study systems for these questions. Yeah. Um, so yeah, kind of getting into that, you gave a nice overview there. Is there like one uh project that you're working on now that you're particularly excited about? I know you have a lot of different things going on, but is there one that you're like, oh, this is really super exciting right now?
Yeah, I tend to say that I'm super excited about all the things that I'm working on, but one of the things we've been very recently working on is contest behavior. So um, ant colonies do often fight other ant colonies, and in fact, the argument can be made that the only real major enemy that many ants have is other ants.
Okay.
And certainly in our species, it's the case that they are aggressive towards other ant colonies. Not always, interestingly. So sometimes we think they may, in fact, live in a neighborhood of related colonies, in which case they are less aggressive. But many kinds of ants, and including ours, um, use other ant colonies not only as food, but
Mm.
also as a source for labor. So a lot of ants will, in fact, steal brood, meaning immature um,
Oh, yeah.
other ants, larvae, uh, worker larvae from other ant colonies, and then bring them up in their own nests to become workers in their own nests. So sort of bolstering their own workforce by effectively stealing the offspring of another ant colony. So they, you know, kill multiple birds with one stone, so to speak. They want to get rid of competitor colonies, but they also benefit a lot from bolstering their own workforce. And
Wow.
in ants, it's important to recognize when you're comparing ants to many other animals and including many other insects, they have an incredibly long development time. So my rock ants, for example, the development time from egg to adult is about a year. We think the typical worker lifespan maybe about 2 or 3 years, which means they're essentially immature as long as humans are, or a little bit longer.
Yeah.
And immature in this case is not like a beetle larva, which is just happily independent, just not sexually active, but
Right.
living by itself in the soil. These ant larvae are like human babies. They cannot move by themselves. They have to be groomed, fed, kept warm, not too warm, 24 hours every day for the whole year that they're developing. We think that certainly in the larval stage, when most of the growth happens, they they probably need to be fed every few minutes. So um, there's an incredible level of basically offspring care
Yeah.
involved in raising additional workers in an ant colony. And not all ants, the development time is as long, but it is in Temnothorax. And so they benefit enormously if instead of having to, raise 50 workers laboriously over a year, they can just basically steal some that are mostly grown but not quite adults from another ant colony. Um, and
And
so, and they like to do that, and they even do it with related species. So we know that they do it from their own species, but it's harder to detect, of course, because they all look the same once they're adults. You'd have to do a genetic study to find out how many of them exactly were,
sure, yeah.
are actually offspring of the resident queen. But sometimes they steal brood from closely related other species that may differ a little bit in color and so on. And we actually did a recent study in which we surveyed several populations as to the incidence of this mixed species, uh, looking for mixed species colonies. So looking for how many of the colonies had workers from another colony. And essentially there are about four species that all seem to happily steal from each other,
Wow.
although two species particularly steal from the other ones. Um, and so that, especially in dense populations, seems to be a fairly common event. So we actually think, especially since this species, they don't eat very much, so their metabolic rate is not very high. We think that this competition with other ant colonies is probably the major selective force that drives a lot of their behavior.
Wow,
So anyway,
that's
that was a long introduction to saying they care a lot about other ant colonies
yeah.
and they have to defend themselves against them. And so we have become, in my lab, interested in the last few years in really how they do that and how they coordinate, and two swarms or two collectives facing each other and trying to outmaneuver each other. Potentially there's a lot of potential for coordination or clever group strategies.
Sure.
And our initial result is incredibly interesting, I think, in that we found that it's likely that they can estimate not only how many workers their own colony has and how many workers the opponent colony has, but that they can even estimate how many brood the other colony has, sort of their resource value potentially,
Like
without necessarily going inside of it.
that's
Um,
amazing.
yeah, and so we think they must extract this indirectly from maybe the behavior of the workers from the other colony, but it's actually not right now known what the mechanism for that is.
Wow,
So
that is
anyway, that's
fascinating.
in terms of what we're doing right now. I think this is one of the most interesting things because people haven't really studied, what are the mechanisms for what are the collective strategies they use when they're faced with these opponent colonies.
Wow, that is super interesting. That and I yeah, you headed off one of my follow-up questions at the pass there because I thought, well, do they send spies in? How do they know these things, right? But that's just
I mean, I
amazing.
think they try. So sometimes there is an ant that will try to sneak into the other nest, and if they can get away with it, they'll go into the other nest and just grab brood and run away. Um, but but often they can't get away with it, because of course the other colony is defending their
Sure.
entrance.
Yeah.
And even inside the colony, if an intruder is detected, they're often either kicked out or dismembered and kicked out.
Boy. Man, that is super interesting. I kind of well, I do have a list of questions that I want to get to. I want to like just talk about cool ant
Yeah,
behaviors all
yeah.
day. But I do want to kind of so one of the reasons that I do this podcast is to introduce our students, graduate students and undergraduates as well, to like sort of different people's paths through science. And so I wanted to ask you about, did you always know that you wanted to be a scientist? Did you know you wanted to be a behaviorist? Did you love ants as a kid, or was this a gradual sort of progression that got you where you are?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I appreciate you doing this. I think it would be good for everyone, students, and I'm even thinking of my own kids, to hear more stories from people of how they got to where they got to. In my case, it is pretty linear and boring. So
I don't
I
know. Those are
actually,
some pretty cool questions. I don't know if it's boring.
yeah, no, I mean, I'm happy where I got to, but the path there is fairly linear. I didn't always know I was going to work on ants, but I did have a fascination with animal behavior early on. And I actually remember clearly in fifth grade deciding that I was going to be a biology professor,
Oh,
and
wow.
then kind of even talk to my teachers about what should I take in high school, in order to achieve this goal. Um, and for example, one of my teachers told me it'd be better to take chemistry instead of biology because they'll repeat everything about biology anyway once I got to college. But chemistry, I probably benefit from having more of that in high school. And I think he was right.
Huh.
But in any case, so I knew I wanted to do biology, and I kind of knew I wanted to go into academia. And that's basically what I did. I did my undergrad. I'm from Germany originally, so I did my undergrad in Freiburg, which is in the southwest corner of Germany.
Hmm.
And then I thought it would be good to do a year abroad, which I also, every student and young person who hasn't done this yet, highly recommend. Mostly because you learn so much about your own country. It's not even that much. I think people think they go to another country and they learn something there, but I think it's mostly um, that's the same reason that interdisciplinary work is so interesting. You suddenly realize that there are all these unstated assumptions that you're living with that you cannot see until you step outside of them.
Yeah.
Um, it's like that famous metaphor with the fish who doesn't understand what water is.
Right.
Because of course, if you're always in water, you can't understand what water is. It takes going outside of it to understand that you were surrounded by it. And so I went. At the time, my university did have an exchange program, and I ended up going to UMass in
Okay.
Amherst for a year as an undergrad. Actually, they classed me as a grad student because of the difference between the German and the American system.
Sure.
But I could just take whatever classes really there that I wanted. And then when I was about to go back, I said, okay, when I'm back, I'm going to be doing a master's thesis. And I wanted to do my master's thesis on, you know, with an advisor and on a topic that was promising scientifically. And so I actually, at the time, of course, there was no Google. Um, and I had to go to the library and look through this abstract database
Uh-huh.
it was on a computer already, but not online. Anyway, I basically searched the literature for which university in Germany had the most publications on animal behavior.
Oh, wow.
And that was Würzburg. Um, So I said, okay, when I'm back, I'm going to go to Würzburg instead of Freiburg, where I did my undergrad. And so I switched universities. I went to Würzburg, and um, actually, it turned out there were two universities who had a lot of publications, and one was Bielefeld, and they mostly worked on guinea pigs. But I'd had a guinea pig as a kid, and I thought they were pretty boring, so I decided. And Würzburg was the Department of Bert Holderblatt, and he is kind of a famous ant guy. He's actually now at ASU, funny enough, but it's coincidental with me being in Arizona.
That's
But
cool.
he was he was in Würzburg at a time. He was famous for working on ants, and so everybody in that department worked on either ants or bees, and so and they were incredibly productive. So that's where I went. I did my master's thesis there and my PhD, and I ended up working with Lars Chitka, who, once I got there, I just decided he was a good fit for me. He was kind of young and dynamic, and I
Hmm.
felt he was going to be destined to do great things, which I think is true. And he and I was actually his first PhD student.
Oh, neat.
Um, yeah, I did my PhD with him, and then that kind of set me on this path of doing social insects. So the model system was completely sort of yeah, I don't know if you want to say this is coincidence or strategy, but it was based on the fact that they were publishing a lot.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think it was also in Massachusetts. I worked with Melinda Novak, who was in the psychology department and worked on rhesus monkeys.
Okay.
And I think that's kind of what in my young mind I had thought I would always do, work on these interesting primates or something. But when I was there, I realized how much work it was and how much work went into animal care. And just, we had a main subject that was doing this cognitive study that then died in the middle of it. And,
Oh,
how much of your research is sort of fragile when it depends on these one or two actual animals that are the study system.
yeah.
So social insects was a nice opposite thing to that.
And you mentioned something there about, they were working a lot on it. So you had this wealth of information in this system that you were working on. And I think social insects, just from outside, I'm a bird guy. From outside, they seem super awesome, both for that and for the sort of like unexplored things, that like there's just I'm sure there's species that we haven't even discovered yet, right? Like, because you think
Yeah,
of the diversity of I mean, just ants in the tropics, and it's just mind blowing. So,
yeah,
yeah, it seems like a
that's all
wealth on
true.
both
But
sides.
yeah, all that is true, Jim. But I will say, I think when you're thinking of a student making these decisions strategically, which is not always true, and I think there's perfectly valid to say, this is the system I love and this is what I want to work on. But
Yeah,
I would say I'm not a rainforest person. I find it mind blowing and lovely to go to these remote,
yeah,
exotic places and just see the grandeur of it. But I wouldn't want to work there. I mean, it's hot, uncomfortable. You have to bring supplies. I did a study with City Cameron on tropical bumblebees in Peru. It was incredible as an experience as a grad student to spend a couple of months in the jungle there. And I actually did do a field study also during my grad school in India, also in an incredibly remote area. And I wouldn't miss those experiences for the world, but I would have never staked my career on this kind of work.
Yeah.
And some people do that, and I have a great respect for it. But if you're a student, you have to be clear, if you want to have a family, if you want to live somewhere, if you want to get tenure, you have to be able to crank out publications, and working in the Amazon or something like that. Obviously, I'm not discouraging anyone who loves that region, but I am saying it comes with a price, which is, you lose your luggage or something breaks and it's not replaceable and you can't go back for another year, or if you get funding again or something, it's just incredibly fragile as something to stake your career on, in my opinion.
No, I
So
think
that
that makes a
wasn't
lot of
really
sense.
my thing.
Yeah, yeah. And I
And,
mean, even
with yeah,
oh,
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like the practical considerations. I remember when choosing a study system when I was a graduate student, I was in a bird lab. It was going to be birds, but I ended up working on song sparrows, which are super common. I adore them. I think they're really super cool. They're everywhere, which was part of the thing was we were going to compare different populations. So I needed something that was everywhere, that was abundant. Um, they have territories where you can go find them, and all of these sorts of things. I don't know. Sometimes we think of biology and the sort of like glamorous stuff that you were talking about, these wonderful remote areas where it's just like the grandeur of it. At the same time, we're doing science, right? We need sample sizes. We need to make sure that we can do it in a reasonable time. We can't be in grad school for 30 years, right? I mean, I tried, but they they told me I had to leave.
They kicked you out. Yeah, I mean, exactly. And the other thing you said too, I think you once you get to know a study system or a topic area, there are always lots of open questions.
Yeah.
Um, and I actually teach a course right now. I literally just came from teaching this course on how to write a dissertation proposal
Oh, lovely.
and how to motivate your work, and it's very important to think about that. And sometimes you just are determined to do one thing and you're looking for the motivation rather than the other way around, and that's fine. But I think it's important to figure out, um, a conceptual background, some reason why other people would want you to do this, not just why you want to do this.
Yeah.
Um, but honestly, most study systems and most topics have unanswered questions, right? So
Yeah.
it's more usually a matter of learning enough about your topic to understand what the big unanswered questions are than it is to, I've never met anyone who said, "Oh, I started working on the system, but then I realized there weren't any open questions anymore."
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
stopped.
We just
That's
solved
not
it.
really,
It's done.
we solved it. I mean, you would think that's theoretically possible, but I think it's not that common. I think once you learn more about it and you also learn the intersections with other areas,
Yeah.
you always find other interesting things.
I mean, we're still finding new things out about mice, about Drosophila, right? I mean, we know
Yeah,
so much,
exactly.
but like there are still things we don't.
Yeah. And I consider myself a behavioral ecologist. So in behavioral ecology, actually remember having this debate at a behavioral ecology conference. In behavioral ecology, I think people pride themselves on working on unusual systems and sometimes in the field and not all working on Drosophila or model systems of some kind.
Yeah.
And I think that's good to some degree, because I do think that if our knowledge of the world consisted of just a handful of model systems, it would be
Yeah.
quite limited and maybe
Yeah.
biased in certain ways because those model systems are not randomly chosen.
Right.
But at the same time, I think as a student picking a question or picking a career, it's important to understand what the trade-offs are. So
Hmm.
there are benefits to starting with something. For example, there are just huge benefits to working on something where other people have already figured out how to keep it alive in the lab.
Yeah.
If you have to do that figuring out yourself, you just lose a lot of time on it,
Yeah.
or how to find it in the field. It is not even about the lab, just where basic techniques have been established.
Right.
And, in Drosophila, of course, not just basic techniques, but lots of sophisticated, fancy techniques have been developed, and you can use those to answer your questions better. On the other hand, you might be fascinated with something that's not as well explored, and there may be more novel things you can find there. But, going too far afield where nobody has established anything means you end up doing a lot of descriptive work and a lot of just kind of figuring out how to keep them or find them or
Or tool
how to even,
development, you know?
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so that's not everybody's cup of tea either.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, that's really good advice. So we're getting towards the more advicey section of the questions. And this one asks about a common thing that happens to most of us. We get a lot of external criticism in science all through our training as practicing scientists. We get reviewed, etc. But we also have that inner critic that reviews us internally, that voice in your head that says, I don't think that's a very good idea, or you can't really make that happen. And I wondered how you confront that voice and how you're able to either silence it or work past it or maybe even make it work for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think I've had that before. I think um, I'm a great fan of external critique rather than internal. I mean, I really think this is related to what I said about going abroad. I think it's very easy to get stuck in your own head and to just kind of have assumptions, good or bad, about yourself that aren't really that based in fact. And I have this, I feel like I have this discussion. Uh, I had some version of this discussion with my daughter recently. I think it's really important to understand how other people see the world, and to understand that what you're, I work a bit in cognitive science, right? I was talking about collective behavior, but I actually also am a fair bit interested in what goes on in the individual brains and how they make inferences about the world. And it's just remarkable how often our inferences about the world are just completely wrong. And every study after study shows this. And what also study after study shows is it's incredibly important to realize that your brain is not a truth making machine.
Uh,
Your intuition about the world is not actually about accuracy, or that's not what it's adapted to do. What it's adapted to do is to make you do the thing that's most likely to lead to survival and reproduction, right? Um, and that doesn't always imply, sort of having accurate estimates of mechanisms or even accurate estimates of what other people think.
yeah.
And I mean, I know this is kind of an abstract way to answer the question, but I think it's really important to not get stuck in your head and to frequently interrogate other people. And I mean that about your writing. So if you're writing a proposal or you're writing a paper, show it to other people. I just submitted a paper. I mean, I'm fairly senior now, but before I submitted it, I sent it to a colleague here in my department, actually two colleagues. And I said, hey, if you just have a little bit of time, can you glance over this and tell me if my framing is wrong? And, one of them said, yeah, your framing is wrong. And then I rewrote it. And, I think that's good. I think this is just the only way to approach getting something more accurate about yourself or your writing or your science or anything really, is to actually try to get input from other people and then rely on that input a fair bit. So that would be my advice.
I,
Don't overthink things in your own head.
I I also think this feels a little meta to me, but like someone who studies the value of collective behaviors is like it makes sense that you're like, you know what? There are other there are other sources of input that you can go to. Like I love that.
Huh. Yeah, and it's important, since I do work on collective behavior, it's important to understand which kinds of collective information are good
Ah,
and which
yes.
kinds are not. So do not post your proposal on Facebook and then go by the number of likes or something like that. Not
Yeah.
that anybody would do that, but that's the
Right.
kind of thing that is more likely to confirm biases than it is to give you accurate information. What you want is independent judgments from a number of people, ideally high quality, people who you think know what they're doing. So,
Right.
your
Yeah.
mentor or colleagues, people on your committee. I mean, I think if we're talking concrete advice for grad students, most grad students underutilize their committee.
Yeah.
I think, most universities, the students have a 3 or 4 or 5 person thesis committee, and to a large extent, those people are happy to meet with you with individual students, outside of formal committee meetings, and or just be, hey, I wrote this proposal or paper, or even just plan for what I'm going to do. Can I send it to you now, and then we meet next week and you tell me what you think? I think that kind of input is incredibly valuable.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, so you have these communities that are and you can build these communities of people whose opinions you trust and respect and whose work you trust and respect and yeah, those are the right voices to listen to.
And since I'm coming next week to give a seminar, I would also say a lot of grad students underutilize seminar speakers. So I always tell my grad students, and I remember Bert Holbler doing this when I was a grad student myself. Um, you know, Maybe Memphis is different, but a lot of places, the seminar series invite all these people, and then the students make, and maybe sometimes the faculty make less use of it than we would sometimes wish. And I understand that not everybody has time to go to X number of seminars every week.
Sure.
But if there's somebody who's even remotely in your area and they have an individual meeting slot open, sign up for that meeting slot. And if you care nothing about their work, just use them as a sounding board for your own work and your ideas. You have a new idea for a chapter in your thesis, or you're working on your proposal right now, or you have some other idea, and you just use them as some random scientist who might review your paper, and you say, hey, I'm about to do this, or here's a paper that I just wrote, and you explain it to them, even just in 5 minutes, and you ask them for their feedback. And I think that's a great way to get outside feedback on your work that is fairly unbiased, because it just comes from somebody who's generally in the field but has no prior knowledge or really prejudices about you or
Yeah.
what you're planning to do.
That's great. I feel like this is a common thing. I mean, it was pretty much every place I've been, it is like you said, it's hard for people to have time for all these things, but it can be. I feel like I had great conversations even when I took a flyer and just met with somebody in a completely different area. And then you end up having this wonderful conversation. Very worst thing that happens is one more scientist, you know?
Yeah. And usually they're only like half-hour meetings or whatever. I mean, what is the worst that could happen?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
if you're a little awkward, if you don't know what to do, you show them your lab and point to some equipment or whatever, and you can get the half hour to disappear pretty quickly. But if the best thing is that, that could happen is that they give you some great idea, some outside perspective on something you were thinking about. Or
Absolutely.
even just you read their nonverbal cues about whether that particular version of your elevator pitch worked
Hmm.
and created a spark in their eyes,
Right.
or whether they're falling asleep. And, either way, that's valuable information.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, okay, so you've given a ton of good advice already. I'm going to ask that. There's a standard question I ask is, if you were going to give advice to a, say, undergrad version of yourself working in today's world of biology and science, um, is there additional advice that you would give that person?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, of course, I am a child of my time, or however you want to put it. So who knows? The undergrads of today might have a different world ahead of them and different ideas, and I don't want to presume that I would know better what to do. The number one advice that I give to undergrads, but I don't know if this is the target undergrad you have in mind, is to work in the lab in the first place.
Oh yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, I think a lot of students, even when they're fascinated by a field, underestimate how important it is to get into a lab as early as you can in order to have a chance to maybe publish something. Um,
Yeah, to see that whole
and
process. Yeah.
yeah, to see the whole process, and also, um, there's a lot of human stuff that's part of it. That's not just about being in a lab and measuring things,
Great
just
point.
understanding how professors talk, understanding, what is the difference between a grad student and a postdoc and a professor in the sort of life of the university and how they
Hmm.
see themselves. Um, the different, often different professors have very different visions of what or view perspectives on how science works, but also what the interesting questions are, and just getting a little bit exposure to that. If you're lucky, being able to go to a professional meeting and present a poster on the stuff that you did. I think all the undergrads that have done that in my lab have come back and said they learned so much just about, how to talk to academics and, um, the diversity, even things that we as mature scientists maybe think of as obvious, but how narrow ultimately the questions are that individual research projects are asking. That's something that a lot of students initially have to get used to. And that really helps if you're going to go for grad school or something like that. It helps to have a better idea of that beforehand, to
Yeah.
be able to pitch at the right level what your interests are.
Right. Yeah, we want to do these big, grandiose discoveries, right? But like those take all these little bite-sized chunks. And
Right.
being able to have the big vision is great. That's a talent in and of itself, but to be able to chunk it into digestible bits is
Yeah.
another talent as
Yeah.
well.
And I mean, I think I have one more practical advice that I'll say real quick, which is, learn coding and learn R and become good at it. I mean, I don't know if that's too obvious to even mention,
Oh
but
no,
um,
you're speaking my language. I'm there for it. I teach an art course, so yeah, everybody listening, let's do it. Let's code.
I mean, I don't know if it's obvious or not. I meet students who've already got a lot of experience with that when they start grad school, and I meet other people who have no experience with it whatsoever.
Yeah.
And it really can, you're going to have to learn it no matter what if you go into science. I mean, some fields it's more Python than R.
Hmm.
And I think ultimately maybe the specific language doesn't matter as much, but just being comfortable with that kind of approach
Right.
and maybe even being able to use GitHub or something, it just gives you a head start on a lot of things. And, as far as straightforward things that you can take a class on, that
Yeah.
ranks pretty highly up there.
And there's some wonderful online tutorials too. I mean, there's some, as with any, there's some that are useful and some that aren't, but there's some that are so good that you can really make
Yeah,
some good
absolutely.
inroads.
And, like any topic that you want to learn about, often it's more useful to have a project where you actually need to use it than it is to
Yeah.
kind of take it
Yeah.
dry.
Yeah.
But if you don't, if there is a class or maybe there's a project-based class or something, I think all of the methods are good. And it doesn't have to be a class. It could be, like you said, sort of self-teaching with tutorials, and there's also good books and so on. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Excellent. Those, yeah, all good advice. Okay, so two more questions for you. Uh, One is, what do you do when you are not sciencing?
What do I do when I'm not sciencing? Well, there's a lot of my life that's just taken up by the kids right now. So just, laundry and cooking and things like that.
Sure.
Um, and driving people to their sports events and things like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Um, when I take time off of that, I'm not a good artist, but I like to do art, just sort of as a meditative thing.
What sort
I
of
also,
is your medium that you work in?
because I'm not actually technically good at anything and I'm just doing it as a kind of fun thing. I don't know if I have one. I just took a workshop here. The Desert Museum in Tucson is kind of a famous zoo, but they also have this Associated Art Institute.
Oh, nice.
Um, and so, every time I've been there, it's all retired ladies and me. So that just tells you what kind of tests they are. But I did one on collages with Japanese paper. That was really fun.
Oh, nice.
And I also really like snorkeling. So I love the ocean, but there isn't any ocean in Tucson, so I have to go somewhere
Yeah. Yeah.
to do that.
Yeah. If anybody tries to
But
sell you
anyway, yeah,
oceanfront property in Arizona, don't bite.
buy it. Yeah, exactly.
Ah, that's very it's interesting. the more scientists I meet, the more people have these artistic or creative outlets as well. And I think for me personally, there's a nice balance there. It really helps me to have
Yeah.
that balance. Um, so is there anything that you wish I had asked you about that I didn't?
That I wish you had asked about. I mean, um, I don't know. If you were going to ask me what I find most important, I've been thinking a lot about kind of philosophy of science in the
Uh-huh.
last maybe 10, 15 years. And I feel that that's not receiving as much attention in the curriculum as it should.
Oh
And
yeah.
what I mean by that are things like, for example, uh, what is the scientific method and why do we have the different steps? And I find that both professors and students usually think they know what it is, but don't. Um, and I also teach a course, for example, on what is the purpose of modeling in biology. So a lot of people do models. People get trained in math often don't think about what the model is actually supposed to do for biology. And people who get trained in biology often are a little bit afraid of the math
Yep.
and have this vague feeling that modeling would be good, but don't really know what to do with it. And so I think there's kind of a gap often in thinking about what it is that theory can achieve for biology. And so this is a little bit separate from the scientific method point, but both in my mind are connected because they're both about why are we doing science the way we're doing it? Um, what is the motivation behind using this technique? And I think people should think about that more. And I think
Yeah.
in a world where there are competing narratives about what's true, or where science gets accused of having a preferred viewpoint or a bias towards concluding one thing rather than another thing, or maybe making things up out of monetary incentives. I
Yeah.
think it's really important that individual scientists, including, grad students that are maybe listening to this, feel like in their mind they have a really solid argument for why science is more objective. It's all well and good to say, well, we're scientists, you should believe us, but why should, in fact, people believe us more than any
Uh,
other interest group? Do we actually have a good narrative for why that is the case? What is the if you want to get technical, the epistemology? What is the argument that we think we are more right than other people,
yeah.
which we do think, right? And I think there are reasons why we are justified in claiming this, but if we don't know what they are, then it doesn't really work that well.
I,
So I think that's really important a thing to think about for students and faculty alike.
I love that you brought in the epistemology because I was going to say to me that was what was connecting what you were talking about the philosophy of science and modeling. It's how do these tools get us to know what we know, right? And really thinking deeply about that, I feel like it's hard sometimes when you're in those lather, rinse, repeat stages of the scientific process where you're like, I have to crank this out. I've got my plan. I'm doing these experiments. I need this sample size, you know, th- but it's worth taking those moments or taking some moments to be like, why am I doing it this way? What is doing it this way going to show me? And really dissecting
Yeah.
that.
And how strong is my inference, and
Yeah.
the I think the whole replicability crisis has hit psychology a little bit more than biology.
Okay.
But it is also sort of a movement towards open science and pre-registration that is slowly taking hold in sciences like biology. And I think it's pretty important, especially as we move towards more and more preprints and sort of
Hmm.
more and more sources of supposedly scientific information. I think it's pretty important to think about, well, which of these tools or strategies are indispensable, or maybe not indispensable, but what things will make something more believable and what things will make something less believable. And,
Yeah.
how much do I value, for example, pre-registration, and why is that even a thing? Why do we want to pre-register things?
Can
Um,
you elaborate on pre-registration just a wee bit? I
yeah,
know
so
I've got to let you go at some point here, but I just wanted to
that's
just
fine.
wrap that up
Um,
there.
Yeah, no, this is my shtick right now. I actually do a lot of outreach with local schools as well, and I don't talk about pre-registration there, but I do talk a lot about inference and how
Uh-huh.
we know what we know. So I think to step back just a tiny bit, in my view, maybe just one of three major points of science and the scientific method specifically is to make predictions before you know the answer, right? To
Hmm.
say, I'm going to set up my experimental design and I sort of make a contract with ultimately myself, usually, or with my co authors, that if the result is A, we're going to conclude this. And if the result is B, we're going to conclude this other thing, right?
Yeah.
That's what the scientific method essentially says. And that's what we mean by predictions. We have contradicting hypotheses and they make contradicting predictions. And the predictions are basically specific statements about what am I going to conclude if the results look like this, the,
Right.
the thing that I'm measuring like this. Now, the problem with that is, as we all know, in real life, often midstream, somehow things change and we get results and we end up either not having well-formed predictions that we made before we got the results, or we have had to or decided to change the question around somewhat. And we end up not really making genuine predictions, but interpreting results in hindsight.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is it's not that that's never valuable, and it's not that you should not deviate from your original plan if you realize the original plan was bad. Um, but the problem is the inference is just much less strong. There's this book that I use for teaching called The Nine Pitfalls in Data Science or something like that.
Hmm.
And they talk about the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, where you basically shoot at a wall and then point the target afterwards. But paint the target afterwards. But they give many real life examples. For example, if you're a bank, you just hire 100 different brokers that have different investment strategies. And you have them all invest something. And then you calculate after a year who made the biggest return. And then you don't tell the customers about the 49 other ones. And you just say, I have this one broker and he made a 10% return when the market was just 5% or whatever.
Hmm.
And so he clearly knows exactly how to invest. And so you should go with this plan in your investment. But this is what actual banks do. And now that I framed it this way, you know why that is not a good, it's a good strategy for the bank, but you know why the customer should be suspicious, right? Because you're getting sold this plan that supposedly had a 15% return, but you don't know whether that was cherry picked from 100 plans that on average had much worse return.
That's
So
post hoc ergo propter hoc, right?
yeah, exactly. But not only that, so it's not only that we often sort of in our minds find excuses post hoc. It's also that if I'm allowed to change what the set was that I started with after I know what the results are, right? I get a very biased idea of what the probabilities actually were of getting to this result. And the same exact thing happens in science when, for example, you only decide afterwards how many variables to put in your model. That's exactly like having 50 brokers run the
Hmm.
race.
Interesting.
And so pre-registration is this open science initiative. I mean, several journals are now offering this, and I think it's still in flux as a social construct how we're going to run this. And psychology is becoming more common. But it's this idea that you're not making the contract just with yourself. You're actually writing up your predictions before you get your results and your experimental design and what the question is and what variables are going to be in the model, what analysis is going to be used exactly. And you give it to somebody, for example, in uh, the Open Science Collaborative, or you give it to a journal or some other person who sort of either they publish it or they just hold on to it, but they have um, a formal way of archiving what you said you
Yeah.
were going to do. And then you do it, and then your results get compared to what you actually had said you would conclude.
Yeah.
And then you get a stamp of, either some journals do registered reports, which is the implication there is that you agree with the journal that they're going to publish the paper no matter what the results are based on the setup. In which case, you also get the benefit of not having the reviewers complain
Right.
that you should have done post hoc arguments. And the other version is there's no agreement with the journal, but at least you can have this stamp of pre-registration on your paper that says, I pre-registered it, and so I didn't, in hindsight, change my model or change anything about my argument. And in fact, it turned out, I'm concluding this based on what I argued before knowing that this would be the result.
Yeah.
And, the implicate right now, I think in biology, this is not common. And so people may not really know how to interpret it that much yet. And psychology is becoming more and more common. And people really make arguments that when there are two studies showing different things, for example, and one is pre-registered, there should be more weight put on that the inference is stronger if it was, in fact, pre-registered study, because they weren't running 50 people.
And yeah, I like the way that you frame this too, because it's about strong inference, right? It's not saying, because we make discoveries, and if you have so much invested in a question and it goes awry, but now you have this wonderful correlative data set. Well, I mean, I feel like you shouldn't throw it away, but
yeah,
it should be
absolutely.
interpreted in the right way, right? That it's like, look, I have this thing. It shows this really interesting thing.
That's exactly right. It's about the strength of inference, right?
Yeah.
And just one method is stronger inference than the other doesn't mean the other one doesn't contain information.
Yeah.
There was a recent controversy, for example, and I don't know how the controversy turned out, but just to illustrate, in education, I don't know if you've heard of this, there's this idea of the growth mindset, right? And that teachers should tell the kids to focus on growth. I mean, not in those words, but
right.
And so there was a pre-registered meta-analysis of these studies that effectively found that the people who have financial gain from growth mindset curriculum, because they sell curriculum along those lines, they authored the studies that find an effect of growth mindset interventions, and the people who don't find an effect of these interventions.
I have not heard of
And
this.
then, of course, that study which was first authored by a grad student, as far as I understand, was criticized enormously by all these people who said, well, but if I put this other factor in the model, and if I do this, and now I'm going to redefine. I mean, a lot of it wasn't just about financial incentives. It was about whether growth mindset interventions particularly help underrepresented groups or struggling schools or something like that. And, there's a lot of ways you can define those groups. And how do you define kids that are struggling? Is it, if you want to find out, is it kids that are struggling that particularly benefit from this approach? How would you define that, right? There's a million different ways to define that. And then, of course, people say afterwards, well, I want to define it differently. And when I define it the way I want to define it, I don't find what you claim is the result. But of course, that's where pre-registration is really important, because who's to say that these people didn't go through 10 different versions of defining that group? I'm not actually saying deliberately as a fraud, but just in their own minds. If you don't feel strongly about pre-registration, you can easily convince yourself that you didn't find an effect at first because you were using the wrong way to define this group.
That's interesting.
But if you define this group differently and you do find an effect, or you just use 10 different versions because you can't decide, and then you publish the one that finds an effect, that is the 50 stockbrokers version of science. And I think we do this in biology a lot too. So I think it helps to think more critically with yourself about how strong is my inference actually, given that I've changed my analysis 5 times since playing with the results.
I think there's sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No. I think that's the argument for pre-registration. Is all I was going to say. So, if you pre-register, that's the very strict version. Where you're not allowed to change anything afterwards. And of course, people have criticized that too.
Well, I think it's an interesting thing to have like more discussions of, like you're saying, about how we do it the right way, because I think you bring up an interesting example of just because you do that doesn't mean that your results won't be critically reviewed by other people, right? And someone can say, well, actually, your pre-registered definition of this that you analyzed your results on is a bad definition of this. Like and it should be this, 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 and this. And if you did that, then you would have different results. So it doesn't get rid of like those dialogues, right? And that moving forward.
No, it doesn't get rid of the dialogue. But of course, in this case, or in the scenario that you just described, I would argue that arguing with the definition in hindsight is probably disingenuous. I mean, maybe you weren't asked beforehand. So, of course, ideally, if you had somebody who's criticizing your work, you would want them to agree on your pre-registration before anyone knows what the results are.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You want everyone to agree on the definition of the groups before anything is analyzed. The problem is if they're arguing afterwards, it's just incredibly likely that they are only arguing if they disagree with your conclusion. And if they didn't disagree with your conclusion, they probably would tell themselves, well, it doesn't seem to matter here because she found the right result. So, if you are arguing with somebody afterwards, you really have to ask yourself, you don't have to ask yourself, you just have to redo it with your definition, but pre-register. Yeah. Because if you're not pre-registering, if you're just using data and after knowing what the results are, changing your definitions, right? That's the problematic part.
Yeah.
And if you didn't pre-register, who else would know whether you had defined it beforehand or not?
Yeah.
Right? You can't prove that you didn't change your mind about the analysis, even if you didn't, in fact, do that.
So this has gone longer than I normally do because I've been super interested in this, and I really appreciate you taking the extra time. I also love that like there's this collective aspect to the pre-registration too. I feel like we've had these meta themes that have gone through here that has been super interesting to me. But I know you are busy. I'm gonna let you go and just say thank you so much for being here. And I'm really looking forward to your talk. It's this week, so I'm going to try to get this posted as soon as possible.
All right. Well, thanks very much. I'm looking forward to seeing everyone in person.
Thanks very much to my guest, Dr. Anna Dornhaus. You can catch her talk this Thursday, October 17th, 2024 in Ellington Hall at 4 p.m. Thanks so much to all of you for listening, and I hope to see you there.